Good morning. Let me open us in a moment of prayer. Lord, we thank you that you have designed us in such amazing ways that we can understand from various aspects. You tell us that we're fearfully and wonderfully made, and we thank you for how you have designed us that we can appreciate your glory and your goodness. And just give you this next 45 minutes and come to you with gratitude in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, I'd like to introduce our speaker today. Dr. Melody Green serves as the academic dean at Urbana Theological Seminary in Urbana, Illinois. She's Lewis, Tolkien, and other associated Inklings and such scholar. Most recently, she took her thing on the road at St. Andrews, Scotland, and so she's trying to get rid of the accent after being there for a week. But her dissertation topic, as I recall, was something about sacrificial characters in children's literature, which seems a little dark at first when I heard about it, but she has taken a look at the truth of the gospel through myth, through language, through narrative, through story, and I appreciate that she'll be able to share with us today. I've been asked, is she my daughter? No. I did meet her when she was quite young, but I'd like to welcome Melody, and thanks for coming and sharing with us.
I have to say thank you, because when your brother is introducing you, you just never know what's going to happen, right? But thank you so much for letting me come and talk to you. What I'm going to do for the next 40 minutes or so is I'm cramming together 3 lectures I do in a few different classes, and I've done it some other places. I confess I've never crammed them together in 40 minutes before, so hopefully this will work. If not, feel free to ask me questions afterwards, and we'll see what happens. Also, I was going to have a handout for you. I'm going to have it when I come back because it did not get finished. So there will be one, but it's going to be a long wait. So first of all, in order to talk about imaginative apologetics, the first thing we need to talk about is apologetics. And what is apologetics to begin with? So, wait a second. Oh, it worked. That's amazing. So apologetics is a term that comes from the Greek. That is the Greek word there. I'm not going to attempt to try to pronounce it, but apologia is a translation of it. It means literally speaking in defense. Now, in the classical Greek legal system is where this term first came from. And in that system, how things would work, if there was a case that needed to go before the court, there would be the prosecution. That sounds familiar. They deliver the charge. Then there's a defendant who would reply with their apologia. That is one of 3 things at that time. It could be, it was always a formal speech. It could be just explaining, no, here's what really happened. It could be, instead, a reply. Well, yes, I did do that, but here's why I did it. Or it could even be a rebuttal. No, none of that's true. The classical example of apologetics from the Greek literature is actually Plato's Apologia, which if you ever had to read it for school or read it for the fun of it because you're that kind of person, it's the story of Socrates' self-defense. He's on trial for his life for being an atheist. What does that mean at that time? It means he believed there was just one God instead of many gods. And Plato's Apologia is what we point to as the first really solid apologetic text that we still have. What's interesting is Socrates failed. If you know that painting right there, that's actually a painting of Socrates about to drink the hemlock that he had to drink because he actually was condemned after his apologia. Fascinating piece of trivia. But as far as the church is concerned, the first time we see the word apologetics, apologia, used is in Acts 26:2. So Paul's in front of Agrippa, and he says, okay, tell me your story. or tell me why I shouldn't condemn you for being a heathen, heretic, and everything else you're doing. So what does Paul do? He simply tells his own story. He's like, well, I used to torture Christians, and then I met Jesus, literally, on the road to Damascus, and now I am a Christian, and telling everybody what happened. That's our first time we see that word in use, is somebody simply telling their own story, what we call today a testimony. But the concept of apologetics, of explaining your faith and why people should believe, is throughout the Gospels. The different Gospels each rely on different forms of apologetics. Mark talks a lot about how Jesus fulfills Old Testament prophecy. Luke talks a lot about Jesus' miracles as proof that what he is saying is true. John talks about where he comes from and who he is. Each one of these is designed to persuade a different audience. Matthew was written to Jewish people, so they're going to know the Jewish prophecies. They just need to be shown, here's how this works. Luke was written to Greek people. They're not going to care about the Jewish prophecies, but they are going to be very interested in miracles. So, as we think about what happened in the earliest church, Paul even changes what he does for different audiences. And I wish we had time to read each of these passages and look at what he does, because they're really cool. So you can take the time later. Acts 17. Paul's speaking to Jewish people, so he uses the Old Testament to show that Jesus is the Messiah that they've been waiting for. 1 Corinthians 15. He's now speaking to Greeks. So he follows his own story. He says, hey, this is how I became a Christian. And then he follows it with an Aristotelian discussion of what does resurrection mean. So Acts 17, 1 Corinthians 15, it's not the truth that changes. It's his awareness of what his different audiences need that changes. What's going to convince them? And this is just a side note. You don't need to remember this if you're not interested, but if you are interested, this is something you could look up and read more about. In the ancient study of rhetoric, there are three things that work together in an argument to make that argument work. There's a claim, there's support, and then there's something we call the warrant. The warrant is the assumption you make about your audience that says, this is why this piece of information is going to work as support for this claim for this audience. Think about Facebook. Think about the arguments you see on Facebook. Why do they never seem to work? Part of it has to do with the assumptions that people are making about what works for me must work for you. What convinced me must convince you. But when people come to the same topic from different backgrounds, with different questions, different assumptions, what works for you may not work for someone else to convince them. Thinking about what they need is what changes things, and that's what Paul was doing. So then we get the early church. Did I mention I'm kind of doing a quick history of apologetics here to get where we are now? In the early church, we get a few people early on. Quadratus of Athens. Great name, right? You should name your kids that. Or you already have kids, tell them to name your grandkids that. He wrote a defense of the faith to Emperor Hadrian, and there, unfortunately, only a small fragment of that whole defense still exists, as far as anybody knows. It's quoted by a guy named Eusebius. He was an early church father. But here's what he quotes. The work of our Savior were always present, for they were genuine. Those that were healed, those that were raised from the dead, who were seen not only when they were healed and when they were raised, but who were also always present. And not merely while the Savior was on earth, but also after his death. They were alive for quite a while, so that some of them lived even to our day. So what is Quadratus relying on? People who knew Jesus. People who could say, hey, I was one of those people who was healed. I met him. He changed my world. Unfortunately, it's a lot harder for us to do that 2,000 years later, right? But thinking about how different things have worked throughout the history of the church or have been used throughout the history of the church is part of what we're doing here. Not long after Quadratus is Justin Martyr. He wrote an apology to the same emperor. He's asking him to stop the persecution of Christians. And he does this by saying he's trying to argue for the truth, the facts of Christian faith, but he does it a different way. He says, Christianity is a rational belief. The story of Jesus isn't that different than any of the stories of the gods that you guys are accepting, which is really interesting because that arguments related to that show up every once in a while throughout the history of apologetics. He's very much like what you do believe, so why do you let these people worship Apollo, but you don't let these people worship Jesus? And Christian practices have been grossly misunderstood. At the time, there were people spreading rumors that those Christians, when they get together, they actually practice cannibalism. They're eating a body and drinking blood. It's cannibalism, guys. They also accused Christians of orgies, of all kinds of other things. He's like, no, you're misunderstanding who we are. So Quadratus and Justin Martyr are writing at a time when Christianity is a small fringe group in the Roman Empire. Time passes, we get other people talking about, hey, here's why you should believe. Here's why Christianity is an acceptable religion to practice. Celsus was a Platonist. He argued that Christians were immoral and irrational based on some of those rumors that had already been going around. And he also argued, well, Jesus was really, this Jesus guy, he was a magician. And he did black magic. And he stole all his best ideas from Plato anyway. Remember Plato, the guy who wrote about Socrates? So Origen writes a book to explain literally directly to Celsus and anybody else he had influenced. It's like, okay, you're saying Jesus is a Platonist, that he followed these teachings of this Greek philosopher. But what if what's really going on is that this Greek philosopher got some things right because Jesus is telling the truth, and this philosopher just happens to have some of the things that Jesus talks about because he wasn't wrong on every point. That is Plato, not Jesus. Then there's Tertullian. With me so far? I know this is a crash course, very quick. Tertullian writes a defense of Christianity against a lot of the rumors that are going around, but his focus is, you know what? People should practice Christianity because it is the most moral of the religions out there. You're interested in morals? Let's talk. Now, I don't know about you, but people I know, when they want to talk about, is Christianity something I should think about, morals are not their top interest. And saying it's the most moral religion is not going to get their attention. But moving along, we're going to skip a few centuries and get into medieval apologetics. Anselm of Canterbury. He was the first to develop something we call an ontological argument. That is, the study of being. Ready for this? Here's his argument. God is a being of which nothing greater can be imagined. If you can imagine something bigger than God, then you haven't imagined God yet. And if you keep saying, oh, there's something bigger than this other thing I imagine, you just haven't started thinking about God yet. Because you can imagine that there could be a being that nothing can be greater than, God exists. What's different about Anselm of Canterbury and the people who we were just talking about? Everyone we were talking about were Christians arguing for Christianity in the middle of the Roman Empire, where Christianity at that time was illegal. Anselm is now in the middle of what we call the Middle Ages. Anselm of Canterbury, Canterbury's in England. England is, by the time Anselm comes around, a Christian country. As far as, at least officially, anyone is concerned, everybody's supposed to be a Christian. You have to have your baby baptized to be counted as a person who's here, a person who's going to pay taxes and be involved in things and get help when they need help. It's a very different culture. And because of that, this argument that to us we might go, I'm not sure that's convincing. It worked for that audience at that time. Then we get Thomas Aquinas a little bit later, a couple hundred years after Anselm. He gives us 5 proofs for God. So I'm not going to walk you through those 5 proofs, partly because something one of my students said once when we were looking at this. He's like, wait a minute. To me, 3 of those look like they're the exact same argument. And the other 2 don't seem to have a lot of weight. But to us, today, it doesn't have the same resonance that it did for its audience at the time. Now, why that is could be a whole other series of lectures, but we don't need to worry about that. The point is, what worked then didn't work later. In fact, Blaise Pascal, late Renaissance, Enlightenment, we call this a transition and when we're thinking about how apologetics works. Blaise Pascal writes this thing called the Pensées. Here's a passage in it. Men despise religion. They hate it and fear it is true. To remedy this, we must begin by showing that religion is not contrary to reason, that it is venerable, to inspire respect for it. Then we must make it lovable, to make good men hope it is true. Finally, we must hope or prove it is true. So what do? He says, to make people, instead of despise religion, want it. We have to show that it's rational, show that it is respectable, and show that it is something we want to love, that we want to hope in. We want it to be true. And then once you have them wanting it to be true, then you can prove it's true. Now, the Enlightenment is an important part of this discussion, and I'm going to try to sum it up in a minute, which we'll see what happens with that. It signifies as a focus on the shift in thought, that the ideas changed, but not just the ideas. How people even processed ideas changed at that time. So, for example, the Declaration of Independence and the Bill of Rights have been described as the most prototypical examples of Enlightenment thinking. Well, what does that mean? It stresses reason, logic, the idea that each individual is an autonomous being who, with the right government and a bit of good education, you can be anything that you want to be. You're a blank slate that can have certain things written on it, but then you get to take power and choose what you want to do. Interestingly, during the Enlightenment, because of this reliance on reason, logic, the scientific method develops during the Enlightenment. Because of that, evidence-based apologetics takes the place of everything that comes before, which we can call philosophically based apologetics, or at least the medieval apologetics definitely are. And it's interesting because Pascal actually even wrote about how, well, Aquinas' arguments don't mean anything. Same thing my student said, right? An example of Enlightenment apologetics, William Paley writes a book called Natural Theology or Evidence of the Existence and Attributes of the Deity. Nice short title, easily remembered. He invents something we call the watchmaker argument. Now, it's not that different from Aquinas in some ways. It's like God created the world just like a watch and let it go. Wound it up and let it go. And said, there it is. There has to be a watchmaker because we have a watch. The question becomes, are we in the same era? Well, the 20th century has been described as the era in which the evidence-based apologetics reigns supreme. I've got a list of guys that you may know some of their writings. Some of you may have read some of their writings. They are the evidence-based apologists, or many of them, of the 20th century who were really working in this area to say, we can think through to faith. You can think about things like, how do we know Jesus rose from the dead? Well, here are our proofs. People at that time, they wouldn't have died for a lie. The disciples who said Jesus rose, they died for this, so they would have backed out if it wasn't true. Things like that become evidence-based apologetics. Even things like biblical archaeology becomes part of evidence-based apologetics. But here's the question. If the purpose of apologetics is to convince the unconvinced, do we still live in a world where that is the main way that people are convinced of things? Another way to ask it is, do we still live in an Enlightenment modernist culture? Or has the ground we are standing on shifted? Evidence-based apologetics assumes that the seeker's question is Christianity true? But what if the seeker's asking a different question? When I listen to some young people I know and get online and end up talking to people sometimes at conferences and things, other questions come up. Does Christianity matter? What does the life and death of resurrection of Jesus mean? Is Christianity good? There's a young woman in her 30s I was talking to not very long ago who said to me, she's like, I've been given a lot of books about why I should believe in Christianity. Josh McDowell's More Than a Carpenter. I read it. I've read it 3 times. She's like, but it doesn't do what I need. And her question even was, is this something good? Is this something I should be part of? If the reader is looking for a context to give all of this information meaning, a dozen books of evidential apologetics isn't actually going to help. So that's where imaginative apologetics comes in. It is a very recent term that's been coined. It was coined by Holly Ordway. She is a professor at Houston Christian University. It was Houston Baptist University until very recently. She used to be an English professor at a secular institution, and she was an atheist. How did she become a Christian? Well, her story is, she says, she was reading a lot of C.S. Lewis's fantasy and Tolkien's fantasy. She even did her dissertation on Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. And reading these books started making her ask questions about goodness, about meaning, and how do things mean what they mean, and what is really of value. Now, like I said, there will be a handout with a bibliography next time I speak, but for now, 2 of her books that are worth looking at on this topic, if you're interested: Not God's Type, A Rational Academic Finds a Radical Faith, and that's just her story, and Apologetics and the Christian Imagination, An Integrated Approach to Defending the Faith. And that is the text that she coins the term imaginative apologetics in. Now, what's interesting about this is that while she coined the term, there's a lot of other people who've been talking about the same thing. Alistair McGrath, for example, has a book called Narrative Apologetics that came out a little bit after hers, but he's still exploring some of the same questions. One of the first things that comes up is, wait a minute, when you look at the Bible, how much of the Bible is actually story? God was using story to teach his people. If God is using story, then why are we just relying on traditional, what I'm calling now traditional apologetics, which is rational thought, thinking through precepts instead of at least also listening to story? It's important that Ordway acknowledges imaginative apologetics, for most people, will not stand on its own. You do need some of these other things to come in. But it's a starting point. So where does she get this idea from, and what does she mean by this term? Well, she actually refers to, and so do other people in this, a short, not very popular essay by C.S. Lewis that I'm not even going to try to read that name out loud because I will stumble over it, but you can see it up there, Blue something and Flandless Fears. It's actually about language. The essay is all about how language works. But in this, he says, for me, reason is the natural organ of truth, but imagination is the organ of meaning. Imagination, producing new metaphors or revivifying old, is not the cause of truth, but its condition. Well, what does that mean? It's straightforward, right? Oh, okay. So reason is the natural organ of truth. It is what we come to truth through. But you can have a truth and not understand what's the context. How do I apply it? What does it mean to me today? Okay, so Jesus rose from the dead 2,000 years ago. How does that affect my life today? So reason is the natural organ of truth, but imagination is the organ of meaning. Now, what does that mean? I'm going to take a strange aside for a moment. As my brother just mentioned, I was in Scotland, and while I was in Scotland, I was there for a George MacDonald conference. It's the 200th anniversary of George MacDonald's birthday. One of the speakers actually talked about math the whole time, and his talk was all about math and meaning. And he said something that really grabbed me. First, he said that actually, higher math, and when you get into things like linguistics, they're the same thing. Literary theory, they're all the same thing. And then he said, you need imagination to have a context for math and for English. It's the same thing. Imagination is what helps us create the metaphors that help us understand everything around us. Imagination is how we put pieces together. Imagination also creates context for things. Okay. Now, some of you may be going, I'm not sure I buy that. I couldn't begin to tell you how he got to that point. I have my notes. I'm still not sure I understand all of it, but it was fabulous. So there are three people that Holly Ordway relies heavily on when she explains and develops this idea of imaginative apologetics. I'm going to quickly introduce their ideas. The first one is C.S. Lewis from Sometimes Fairy Stories Say Best What's to Be Said. It's another short essay by Lewis. It's got a great title like the other one. This one is at least as pronounceable, even if it's a little long. But he's talking about why he wrote The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And he says, I thought I saw how stories of this kind could steal past a certain inhibition which had paralyzed much of my own religion in childhood. Why did one find it so hard to feel as one was told one ought to feel about God or the sufferings of Christ? I thought the chief reason was that one was told one ought to. An obligation to feel can freeze feelings. But supposing that by casting all these things into an imaginary world, stripping them of their stained glass and Sunday school associations, one could make them for the first time appear in their real potency. Could one not thus steal past those watchful dragons? I thought one could. What's he saying? He's saying that when we come to the story of Christ, whether we grew up in church or we're somebody who's just hanging out on the internet, who's never been to a church, but sees certain things said about Christianity, whoever we are, when we come to the story of Christ, we bring certain things with it. Now, at the time C.S. Lewis was writing, he was talking about in England, if you went to school, you went to chapel in school. And I've heard more than one person who went through that experience describing it as a vaccine against Christianity. An obligation to feel can freeze feelings. You come to the story with certain assumptions. You may not even see what's in front of you because you're reading it through those lenses. But if you can take it out of that context, say, what is the real essence of the faith? What is the real essence of the story of Christ? Let's put it in a different place and see what happens. And of course, we get the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe from that. The story of the death and resurrection of Jesus, the story of the atonement, the story of how faith, forgiveness, coming to understand certain things changes who we are in Christ and our relationship to him. So that's C.S. Lewis. Sometimes fairy stories say best what's to be said. Then there's Tolkien. Now, Tolkien is who Holly Ordway did her dissertation on. She spends more time talking about him in some places, while at the same time, he says less than Lewis did on this. So this is from his essay on fairy stories. The peculiar quality of the joy in successful fantasy can thus be explained as a sudden glimpse of the underlying reality or truth. It is not only a consolation for the sorrow of this world, but a satisfaction. And an answer to that question, is it true? The answer to the question I gave at first, quite rightly, was, if you have built your little world as a fantasy writer, well then yes, It is true in that world. That is enough for the artist, or the artist part of the artist. But the eucatastrophe, we see in a brief vision that the answer may be greater. It may be a far-off gleam or echo of Evangelium in the real world. Now, what is he saying here? He's saying when you're reading a fantasy story, a good fantasy story, let's go back to The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. I've used it once, let's use it again. You're reading it for the first time, and then you get to the point where Aslan is dead. It is the worst possible thing that could happen. There is no hope after that, right? There's a battle going on. They're going to lose the battle because they just lost Aslan, who they had all their hope in. It is the worst moment in the lives of the Narnians. But then something happens that changes everything in a moment. That is the moment that Tolkien calls the eucatastrophe, the good catastrophe. It changes everything, and suddenly Aslan's alive, and he goes to the witch's castle and wakes up everybody who was turned into stone. He breathes on them. That's an interesting metaphor, isn't it? Breathes on them, and they're not stone anymore, and they join him in the battle, and they defeat the witch's army. That turn, that sudden shift, is the eucatastrophe moment, the good catastrophe. And Tolkien talks about, in the real world, the eucatastrophe is the death and resurrection of Christ. It is what changes absolutely everything. So when you're reading a fantasy story, there's this joy, good fantasy, not every fantasy. He calls it successful fantasy. There are some fantasy stories that are very popular right now that I would say do not fit this category, but then I don't necessarily call them good fantasies either. But in the stories he's talking about, you get that moment where everything turns around. Besides Narnia, you get the Lord of the Rings. Gandalf is dead. He's their leader. Oh, wait, maybe I shouldn't tell you in case you haven't watched the movies or read the book. Oh, okay, he comes back to life again and leads a battle, kind of like The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, more convoluted. Then we get that moment. There's more than one eucatastrophe in Lord of the Rings. That moment when Frodo is at the edge of the volcano with this ring that he has struggled, and Sam has struggled for ages to get to this place. And Sam says, "Do what you came to do." I am quoting the books, not the movies, sorry. All you've ever seen is the movies. It's like, "Do what you came to do." And Frodo's like, "I've come, but I do not choose to do that which I came to do," and walks away. That is the worst possible thing that could be happening. They don't even know, Sam and Frodo, that their friends are fighting a battle and losing. And if something doesn't change really fast, everybody's going to die. But then something happens that no one was expecting. I'll let you read the books or watch the movies if you haven't yet. But everything changes at once, and the battle is won. Or Harry Potter. I'll let you figure that one out if you don't know the Harry Potter stories, but there is a eucatastrophe in Book 7 that so exactly replicates what happens in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Anyway, that's what Tolkien's talking about. These stories point us to the story of Christ. I'm going to throw in another little side story here. Oh my, we're running out of time. I will throw in a side story, though, that I think is relevant here, and that is this. I was working years ago at a children's bookstore. At that bookstore, the shopping center we were in, every store had to close at 9. But our store, we didn't get customers after 7. The store next door to us was a teacher supply store. They didn't get customers after 7, so we had 2 hours to kill hanging out. Both of the owners of the stores said to their employees, "So hey, this is the children's bookstore, has a lot of stuff you guys should know. So if there's no customers between 7 and 9, read the books in the children's bookstore." So they would come over from the teacher supply store, borrow stuff. One time, a woman came over. It was a little before 7, but she came over and said, "What you got?" And I said, "Hey, have you ever read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe?" She's like, "What's that?" So I handed it to her. She came back later and said, she is crying. She's like, "They shaved the lion." And I said, "Keep reading. Just keep reading." And she's like, "But they shaved a lion." And I had read that book a million times, and that had not hit me the way it hit her. So she went back and read it, And then the next time we were both working, she came in and said, so that story, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, it reminds me of something, but I don't know what. I feel like there's more there that I should know. And then, of course, a customer walks in. But that's the element of what's happening here, what Tolkien is talking about. I'm going to very quickly throw one more in. G.K. Chesterton. If you've never read Chesterton, he's amazing. But then again, I think that of all of these writers, so what can I say? But G.K. Chesterton wrote, his best-known book is probably Orthodoxy, but in both his book Orthodoxy and his autobiography, he explains that his conversion to Christianity was partly shaped by reading fairy tales. He was raised in an atheist home, and the way he describes it, it was a trendy atheist home because Darwinism was what they talked about. Social Darwinism was the thing. And yet, his mother would read them fairy tales, him and his brother. And she actually even had a book of Bible stories that she told the kids, well, these are fairy tales too, but you should know these fairy tales because they're part of our culture and some people believe they're true, but you know they're just fairy tales. But she still read them. In that mix with Snow White, Little Red Riding Hood. So to the child Chesterton growing up in that home, all of these stories mixed together. But he saw, as he's listening to all of them and growing up, that there were certain things that he gained from reading these stories and hearing them. One, in all of these stories, whether it's Snow White, don't eat that apple, Sleeping Beauty, don't touch the spindle, Little Red Riding Hood, don't stray off the path, Adam and Eve, don't touch that tree. In all of these stories, happiness rests on not doing something. And of course, we did that something. But somehow, we have now been saved from a wreck. Little Red Riding Hood, the woodsman comes along and rescues Red Riding Hood and her grandma from the wolf in a rather implausible way, but it still happens. Sleeping Beauty, the prince comes along and wakes up Sleeping Beauty with a kiss. The Bible, Jesus comes along and does everything he did. We've been saved from a wreck. And because of that, this world we live in is imbued with wonder. We didn't have to be saved from that wreck. And because we were, everything is different. Everything is beautiful. And he was recognizing that the world God made is imbued with wonder. And because this world is wonderful, there's somebody we need to thank for this gift. Therefore, feeling the need to say thank you to someone made him say, there must be someone to thank. Now, he makes it clear in both Orthodoxy and his autobiography, he was not a Christian yet when he came to that conclusion. He had to go figure out, where is this person that is there to thank? But he realized that the story of Christ, the story of the Bible, fits all of this, not because it was new to him, because it was wrapped up in with all those other stories. And then he came to understand the truth of that story. I'm going to go ahead and wrap us up there for this week. I'll be back in 2 weeks. We will talk about some other things. I'll give some more concrete examples. I may ask for some stuff from you guys. We'll see what happens, okay? But thank you so much. If you have any questions, feel free to ask, but I know some of you have to go pick up children. So